All right, let's get started. So, how many people have we got joining? We've got people that are really excited to come in now. Fantastic. All right, let's get started. My name is Danielle Stein-Fairhurst. I'm a financial modelling specialist based here in Sydney. It's wonderful to see so many people starting to come back in person, and a big thank you to the CPA Australia for hosting us again today. We have had lots of these meetups online. We're sort of starting to not do quite so many, but having them in person is absolutely wonderful. And there's obviously still quite a demand because we've got hundreds of people who have signed up for this and who are joining us remotely. So it's great to be able to do both. So before we get started, I'm just going to do the welcome to country, which is to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and of course to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us here today. So let's get started. I've known Giles for quite some time through the Full Stack Modeler program. He is the founder and main person for that wonderful group. And when he told me that he was coming to Australia, I wasted absolutely no time in inviting him to come and speak. And I'm pleased to know that he has a lot of other things planned other than just coming to speak to us. Which is fantastic. I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit about the Full Stack Modeler program, but I know that we've got lots of fans here tonight. And could you just raise your hand if you are a Full Stack Modeler? We've got quite a few people here, and maybe a bit of a reaction for those of you who are joining us online. It's wonderful to see you also. One of your missions for this trip is to meet a lot of the Full Stack Modeler people. Yeah. All right. Well, without further ado, I will hand over to Giles. I didn't ask you about questions. I normally ask that in advance. Do you want people to sort of jump in on the chat with questions, or do you want us to wait until the end?
I think let's answer them at the end, but throw them in the
chat. I'll save them up for you, and then you just check in when you're ready.
Yeah.
How about that? Okay.
All right. Thank you. Well, let me try and give myself as much room as possible. So I wanted to start by kind of saying the exact reverse of what Danielle said. So I was coming to Australia to sit on a beach, to meet some Full Stack members and to not talk about Excel at all. But then Danielle kind of planted this seed in my head and said, why don't you come and talk and I'll host it for you. And I like to think in some areas of my life, I'm not a complete idiot. So it was an easy decision to just say, yes, absolutely, I will take you up on the offer. The only thing I said to myself was, I want to talk about something that I really want to talk about. I could have come and spoken to you about modeling standards or Power Query or FAST, and I love doing that. But this is such a big trip for me personally. I was desperate to think about something that was really kind of from my own passion of modeling. So that is where this topic has come from. This idea of the average modeler and what's going on with Excel at the moment. So hopefully you'll kind of get where I'm coming from. If you disagree strongly with anything I say, come and speak to me afterwards. That's totally fine as well. So, everything that I'm going to talk about is really based on the fact that Excel has changed. I'm sure you are aware of this. Over the last few years, I think more so than we've seen for a very long time, the tool that we all know and love has evolved. And I think perhaps we don't quite acknowledge how much it has changed. And my reaction to these changes really depends on what sort of metaphorical hat I'm wearing at any time. And I think I wear one of three hats typically. So as an Excel geek, as somebody that's just loved playing around with Excel and solving problems for 20 odd years, I'm only positive about these changes. LAMBDA, dynamic arrays, Python coming in, which I've never written a line of Python code in my life, but that's another exciting thing for me to try and learn. It's fantastic. It just gives me more to learn and upskill on. Sometimes, not as much recently, but sometimes I wear the hat of a consultant, and I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. So on the one hand, I've got more kind of tools to use to solve problems with for clients, but it also accentuates a couple of challenges that are already there for consultants. Number one, backwards compatibility. If you're really dogmatic and you say, I'm a consultant and the only models I build are with dynamic arrays, well, that's great for you. You might technically be right, but if you hand it over to a team of people that haven't got the right version of Excel, it's no use. And the other challenge is the skill set of the people that you are potentially handing your models over to. And this is kind of the big topic that I'm going to come back round to time and time again, is the average skill set of finance people. Generally, I know we've got an engineer, at least one engineer in the audience, so other people use Excel, but the average skill set of the people now is such a problem, I think, with Excel continuing to evolve. And then the third hat that I wear is one of a trainer, and certainly in the last 3 or 4 years with full stack modeler, I feel a very real sense of responsibility for the skills and the development and the confidence really of lots of people that have trusted me with their training. And I'm genuinely quite anxious about these changes from a trainer's perspective. Something just happened there. I don't know. Is that okay? So, I know what's coming up on the next slide. So what I want to kind of focus in on is 3 things, basically. There's the let function, there's LAMBDA, and there's dynamic arrays. Now, I'm not going to go really kind of tech heavy. Thank you, that was great. I'm not going to go tech heavy, but these are the 3 things that I'm talking about. Now, for anybody that's not used let, LAMBDA, and dynamic arrays, I'm just going to do a really quick, quite deliberately quick, 1 or 2 sentence kind of description. So the let function allows you to assign names to bespoke calculations and define variables inside a formula. The declared names only exist in the scope of a given formula and nowhere else. The LAMBDA function, designed to create custom functions that can be named and reused throughout a workbook. 5G modeling, for those of you that have seen Craig Hatmaker talk about this, with LAMBDAs arguably makes Excel Turing complete. Dynamic arrays, resizable arrays that calculate automatically and return values into multiple cells based on a formula entered into a single cell. None of those updates are simple. If you've not come across these, the description there, I think is quite hard to just get your head around, let alone when you get into the practicalities of it. And part of the concern that I have is that when you look on the major platforms that most of us are kind of active on, especially LinkedIn, but also YouTube and Instagram, you've got all of the biggest kind of personalities in the industry, people that are interested in this, very excitedly showcasing let and LAMBDA and dynamic arrays and showing the technicalities of it. But I feel like we're missing the broader picture. I feel like there's a lack of conversation around, the bird's eye view. Why might you need to use them? What's the real value? When do you use them? And actually, in what circumstances would you not use them? And without that context, Danielle and I were just talking about the Financial Modeling World Cup as another example of this. Fantastic competition where you get to see some of the most talented modelers in the world do the craziest things under pressure. But without that context that, look, this is kind of exceptional and you don't have to judge yourself against this standard, I think there's a risk that we're going to put people off. And I think that means you're going to lose potential superstars of the future in our community and our industry at the first hurdle, because they're going to look at some of this stuff and just go, no, I never signed up to be a programmer. I don't want to learn how to code, so I'll do something else. And I think if you kind of think about the distribution of skills in our community, in the modeler community, the finance community, I think, if I showed you a distribution curve like that with the skill level on the y-axis, on the x-axis, sorry, beginner, intermediate, advanced, and the distribution of, the population on the y-axis, you probably wouldn't challenge me too heavily. It's kind of skewed over to the beginner's side, smaller tail at the end. We kind of get that the proportion of real experts is smaller. So you might not challenge me too heavily if I showed you that distribution curve. And I actually think it's wildly wrong. I think, bear in mind, there's probably a bit of a tweak you'd make, but I couldn't find the right distribution curve. But I think it's more like this. I think the distribution of skills is so skewed to the first few steps. We see this all the time at full stack. Forget Power Query, forget the Power Pivot tool, the data model. We're still seeing people that are struggling with the confidence with sum ifs, index match, X lookup, V lookup, whatever it might be. I think so many people are still in those first steps and they lack the confidence to even just get a few steps ahead, let alone worry about let and lambda and everything else. I tried desperately to get some data to back up what I just said, and I couldn't find it. And I asked people at Microsoft, and they couldn't help me. The only sort of anecdotal thing I've got to share with you is the last virtual summit that I presented at had about 150 finance professionals attending, all, FBP, finance business partners of varying levels. And I asked them at the start, how many of you have ever used Power Query? And more than 85% said no, they'd never used it. And I know there isn't an exact correlation from Power Query to the other tools, but that kind of blows my mind, because for me, in the finance function, Power Query has been a total game changer for a decade. And yet most people still don't use it. And we've had people out there for year after year saying, look, guys, you've got to learn this. It's going to save you days of time every month. It's still not being used. So I think the problem is actually coming at the worst time. And I'm going to quote somebody some of you may be familiar with, a gentleman called Peter Bartholomew. I quoted him. He just DM'd me this as part of a longer message. But I really liked this. He said, a rift valley is appearing and the majority of users are stuck on the wrong tectonic plate, hoping nothing further is going to happen. And I would probably take it further. I think the majority of finance professionals aren't even aware what tectonic plate they're on in terms of skills and the fact that there's any kind of growing issue building up. And that's what I'm going to sort of lean into over the next few slides. So I think there is this impending iceberg that we're heading towards as a community of modelers. And really it comes down to this: that small group of experts, the one person in the company that's always been the Excel person that everybody goes to, that probably built all the macros that nobody else understands, that person is going to get even more highly skilled now that you've got let, lambda, dynamic arrays available. And they're probably right to get more highly skilled, and they're probably going to be technically right to start using them because they're such good tools. And then the rest of us, the rest of this population, the average modeler that I'm going to kind of refer to, is either going to be stuck where they are, or potentially they're going to be put off because the training journey just looks even bigger and scarier. So I kind of mentioned this average modeler term. This was something that I came up with when I first kind of put the description together for this session. And I've been thinking about this in a little bit more detail. So I think you could look at it at a number of levels. At the lowest level of skill, I would say we have the average Excel user, but that really includes casual users, people that don't care how you do things correctly in Excel. They use it because they have to, but they would rather spend as little time as possible using it. Then you've got the average finance professional. So just more broadly, I think that assumed level of skill is far higher as an average than the average Excel user. And then above that, I'm saying the average modeler. If we're using the term modeler, I'm kind of being deliberately vague. Could call it financial modeler, but it might be something else. But I think you have to start assuming they've probably either had some training or they've self-taught to some degree. And at the moment, I'm mainly interested in the average modeler category, which I'll tell you why in a minute. But I also think everything that I'm talking about applies to the average finance professional as well. I'm not really too bothered about the average Excel user because I don't think they're bothered. So I came up with this little matrix. This was me trying to think of the reaction people might have in those categories to this idea that they might have to learn new things. They might have to do things differently to how they've done them before. And this might be one of the things that you challenge me on afterwards. So I think if you're on that beginner side and you're told, hey, there's this new thing called LAMBDA, Here's how you use it. There's a bunch of code in the background. I don't really care whether you understand it, but you just got to use this stuff here. I don't think they mind. I think their reaction's probably quite positive to that. If you're telling me that this thing makes my life easier and I can use my spreadsheet more effectively, that's great. I think if you are an expert, and I'm probably badging in experts, people that are a little bit comfortable with coding and programming, equally, I think you're probably going to have a positive reaction. You might even be saying, look, this is great. This is kind of what I've been waiting for 10 years. I wish we could have done this before. I actually think it's the people in the middle, maybe a lot of people here that have a certain amount of experience, have a particular way of working already, and you know it works, and you trust it, and you've done it for 10 years. You're probably the hardest people to convince to open your mind up to the fact that something like a LAMBDA or building models with dynamic arrays is going to be worth your time. And I do think it is worth your time. I don't think it means that you have to suddenly transform the way that you work, but I do think it's worth your time learning it. So that takes me into sort of the second phase of what I wanted to talk about, which is how do we convince the average modeler? How do you convince these people that it's worth them sort of at least considering changing the way they approach things? And I think the answer to that is you have to show them the value. You can't just show them this sort of thing. Look, here's the let function. Here's what happens. This is the code that sits behind it. So these are a few slides from the USPRIG annual conference that I attended in London. So a number of people got the chance to do 10 minutes or so as a presentation. And Peter Bartholomew, who I had the quote from earlier, had a few slides where he was showcasing let and LAMBDA. Now, if you haven't heard of Peter, he is a genius. So academically, he is on another level. And this kind of stuff to Peter is really, really easy. He showed an example of what he thought was a kind of simple LAMBDA. And I'm going to show you what that LAMBDA is in a minute, and I just want to see what your reaction is. But the idea was that you've got a crane, you've got a little cabin underneath the crane, and there's a pendulum underneath the cabin, and for whatever reason, there's some calculations that are trying to be done to calculate the sort of movement of the cabin, factoring in the pendulum swing that's counter to the movement of the cabin at times. And he showed this. And in his mind, that's quite a simple LAMBDA. And I think to everyone else, that's quite terrifying. And I think that's part of the problem, what's happening there in that LAMBDA, and by the way, that's a LAMBDA with a nested let within it, makes perfect sense. It's a brilliant use of let and LAMBDA. But if you show somebody that's uninitiated to let and LAMBDA, I think it's going to put them off massively. Out of interest, just from the people in here, can you put your hands up if you've used LAMBDA tool so far? Danielle, Gunjan, half used. Out of interest, put your hands up if that looks pretty terrifying to you. Yeah, okay, good. All right, so I think we sort of have to get comfortable as this average group with the idea that coding logic is something that we're going to have to learn. And I think here's an example of something from Craig Hatmaker. This is one of his 5G LAMBDAs. So I've mentioned it in passing a couple of times to people just before we started. 5G LAMBDAs are LAMBDAs that you can import into Excel, pre-built LAMBDAs. Eventually, the idea is that they'll be tested and certified. So if you've got something that is quite complex, for example, Craig is working on depreciation LAMBDAs, and hopefully, if he goes along with this, he'll be doing stuff for inventory modeling. So I just took the CFM exam for the FMI, and the thing that I kept struggling with was just remembering the logic for FIFO and LIFO, the blocks that you had to do to remember what the balance was of the inventory and everything was just a nightmare. And if you said to me, okay, well, actually, you can just go and download a FIFO LAMBDA, and all you have to do is plug in these 3 lines from your model, and it'll just generate the whole array for you, I think that's pretty powerful. But I think that means that we all have to get comfortable with that sort of thing, which if you've played around with VBA for a bit, if you've got into Power Query and you're comfortable with the M code, you're familiar with that. But again, I think for the average modeler and certainly the average finance professional, that's quite terrifying. Once you start to break it down, it's not so terrifying. Everything in green is sort of descriptive information. There's nothing to do with the code. The bit in the middle that you see in red and blue, that's the code. So again, we've just got a lambda with let embedded within it. You've got a little bit of formula work at the bottom there that's kind of testing whether what you enter as a formula will either return the right value or an error. And all the stuff at the bottom is kind of what you get if there is an error. So when you actually start to break it down, it's fine. But I think most people are terrified of this. So here's how I would sort of try and convince a financial modeler that let and lambda is worth their time. So what I'm going to show you is a really simple model. I've got a timeline that's going to be built 3 different ways. All I've got as inputs are 2 input cells. I've got a model start date and I've got a model duration. And I've got these 2 cells named. So the name, literally just on the cell, is model start date and model duration. And that's it. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you the sort of traditional approach to building a financial model timeline. So the idea here is you build this once. I would always build it in a time tab. And then you can kind of link that timeline structure out to all the other monthly tabs in your model. So here you go. This is a sort of standard fast approach. You have your separate blocks. You work out each of the lines of logic you need. So a period counter, a period start date, an end date, a year reference, a quarter reference. You can add as many other things as you want there. If you're into financial modeling, you will have seen this time after time. And then at the top bit in blue, I'm just manually linking each of those lines up to the top, and that becomes the block of stuff that you just copy across your other tabs. So that's fine. Probably experienced modelers would have some sort of template that they would be starting from. Hopefully you're not literally building this from scratch every time. But if you are, it's a waste of time because it doesn't add any value to your life. And this is where I think maybe let, which I'll show you next, but certainly lambda. And when you embed lambda into the name manager, you see some value. So look, here's how you could produce that whole timeline in one cell using let. And it looks pretty nasty when I set it up like that. But essentially each line of logic is built one by one with a name. And then I've used a V stack at the end, one of the new dynamic arrays that just allows you to go, all right, I'm going to stack each of those individual elements one after the other. One cell, one formula, and you get that whole array and that whole timeline. Now, coders would slap my wrist for doing it the way I showed you because they would say, look, you should be splitting your code into individual lines. And there's an instant clash there because if you've done any financial modeling training, you will have been told that you should keep your formulas clear and simple. If you like fast, it shouldn't be longer than your thumb. That's bigger than my hand. It's just completely the opposite to what we've been trained to do. But actually, if you're trying to build logic in one cell, it makes perfect sense to do it like this. So again, you can just see really clearly each line there is one of the elements of the array that I've got in each row. And then at the end, the V stack is adding them all up, stacking them all up one after the other, and that gives you your final array. So I think that's quite nice if you can get comfortable with let. It's a nice introduction into that sort of programming mindset if you've not done it before. What I'm going to show you next is lambda. I'm going to start literally with a blank tab, but what I've got in the name manager is a lambda function with all of that let functionality already set up within it. So literally start off with a blank tab. I'm going to go to the name manager. There's my lambda, LD_timeline. And if you look at the reference, hopefully you can see it underneath there a bit. It's the lambda. I've got to call up the start date and the duration. It's the only 2 things I need to call up. And then all of the let functionality that you just saw on that last tab is in the reference for that lambda. Peter said something. I'll have a look at that later. So what do I need to do as a user? And think of the average finance professional here. All I have to do is call up the name of the Lambda that I've defined. And then all I need to know as the user is the ingredients that I have to pull in. And I need to pull in the model start date, and I need to pull in the model duration. And that's it. So I can start typing it out. I can use IntelliSense, hit the tab key, brings through the rest of the name, close brackets, hit enter, the whole timeline comes up. And you could extend that to another 10, 15 rows if you wanted to, whatever it is that you want. But all you have to do as the user now is remember how to use that named Lambda. Arguably, you don't even need to understand what let does. You don't need to understand how the coding works in the background. This is where the 5G Lambda thing is really interesting, that Craig is such a big proponent of, because his argument is that, genuinely, if you're a user, you're not a developer, you don't need to understand the code as long as it's tested and you know that it works right. So I think that's really interesting. I like it as a way of kind of introducing people to the power of Lambda. I think there are lots of big discussions to be had about the split of users and developers and whether that's the right thing. Is this a black box? I think there are probably far more intelligent people than me that need to kind of debate that out. I really like that as an example. Here's another one. So here's something else that I pinched from Craig. This is another financial modeling example. So you'll see on screen that this is a balance, a control account, whatever you want to call it, a corkscrew being built, 4-line corkscrew, just using a named Lambda. So it will keep repeating, just let it go through. So you call up the name of this Lambda, you call it whatever you want. You've got help on the function, so you've got to pull through the opening balance, the increase, and you've got the hash key, so it's an array, dynamic array, the decrease, close the brackets, hit enter, the whole 4-line corkscrew is built. And it's dynamic. All of these are dynamic. The last example I forgot to mention is also dynamic. If you change the length of the model duration, then this array is going to extend or contract as well. How many people in the room have seen anything like this before so far, Lambda-wise? Okay. So the last thing that I kind of wanted to touch on was this. I think, as a trainer, I'm really concerned about the overall training journey for people. Like, if we accept that the average modeler should try to learn these things, at what point do you plug this stuff into the journey? I think this is probably a pretty typical roadmap, certainly is for what we do at Full Stack. It's pretty much the order of the modules that we go through. So you start with the basics, just navigating your way around Excel, getting used to what you do. I'd probably put shortcuts in there as well, to be honest. Learning some of the basic functions. We all know you don't need to know all 500 functions in Excel, but just getting really comfortable with the basics of, flags for a start, logical functions, sum ifs, XLOOKUP, probably now more than anything. Then moving on to tables. The amount of people we see that aren't comfortable with Excel tables and that don't understand the power that they have with them is unbelievable. Leaning on pivot tables, pivot charts, I think is really useful. And then Power Query. As I said before, like more than 85% of people in that webinar that I did have never used Power Query, which I think must mean that there are so many teams of people that are probably still using Control-C, Control-V month after month to do stuff. And it blows my mind, really, that that's still the case. And I don't think it's the individual's fault, which is something I'm going to come on to in a minute. The responsibility lies in a few places to change this. And then if you get comfortable with Power Query, you've just taught yourself part of what you would have to use if you use Power BI. You've also got things like the Power Pivot and the data model. And I think behind there, I've got best practice, but I can't see it because I can just see my own face. And another version of this, maybe if you were looking more at the sort of corporate finance route or the accounting route, is somewhere within this, you'd have to teach people accounting theory and corporate finance theory. So it's not an exact roadmap. But where do you plug the other stuff in? If we're looking at dynamic arrays, do you throw dynamic arrays in as part of the training journey with all the other functions straight away? Do you just throw let in there as well? Do you put lambda in there as well? Do you hit people with all of these new functions at the same time so you learn everything about these original functions, the traditional ones and the new ones. Python, where do we throw Python in? For me, that feels like it's not going to be used by the vast majority of people. Should we still try and train everybody on the basics? I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I'm not a Python user. Do you do something like this? Do you split it up? Maybe you teach dynamic arrays with all the other functions, but you leave let and lambda until a bit further down the line. Python you could kick out to the end. Do you do it all at the end? So you leave the training journey exactly as it is, and then you do all the new stuff at the end. I'm not so sure about that. This is kind of where my head's at the moment. And I could probably be easily convinced to change it, but I think dynamic arrays are so game-changing. I think the use case for dynamic arrays is so obvious that we should be teaching this alongside everything else. If you look at the FAST standard, which is the standard I've always followed, dynamic arrays totally align with the principles of the FAST standard. You want to build consistent, simple models, and dynamic arrays force you to be consistent. You could argue, if you wanted to make little tweaks to things, you could just have a little, a series row with manual adjustments, and you could factor that into your dynamic array calculation. But in principle, you can't just go into month 6 and go, oh, I'll just add 200K in there. I would probably just add awareness of let and lambda early on. So probably teach dynamic arrays in quite a lot of detail and just start to make people aware of what let and lambda do. But I would leave the really detailed training until you've got through most of the other fundamentals. Everything else on there, you could maybe argue you do it before Power Pivot and the data model.
What about VBA?
VBA, interesting. So, again, I'd be open to having my mind changed on this. We don't teach VBA at Full Stack. So I get that it's useful for certain things. We found that most use cases you can cover through Power Query. I know there are certain exceptions, especially when you're looking at things like debt modeling. We've never had any challenges to the fact that we don't teach it so far. So one of the final things that I wanted to talk about is responsibility. Like, whose responsibility is it then that the average skill set is so far below where I think it should be? Who should be responsible for changing that situation? Is it going to be Microsoft? Seriously doubt it. I mean, they have some help, some forums and some guidance. I always find them really hard to use, to be honest. I tend to go to XLJet usually. So I don't think Microsoft is going to lead the way on this. What about the individual modeler, the average person on the team? I would say that, yes, there is definitely some responsibility on the individual. You've got to take some ownership of your own training journey. But I think it's hardest for the individual to make that change and really kind of see their role and their skills develop if they haven't got the support of their team lead or ideally from senior management. It's so much easier if you've got the head of a finance team or a smaller element of your finance function that gets it. If they understand the roadmap, if they understand the capabilities of Lambda dynamic arrays, then that just makes life so much easier to kind of feed that downwards. And senior management, again, really what you want to end up with is a proper strategy for all of this, a training strategy. And it's one of the final things that I didn't mention on the iceberg slide, that part of the impending problem is you're going to have groups of people in finance functions that are the experts, that are going to do all this clever stuff. And even internally, they're going to hand over their models with all of this new clever complexity, and everybody else on the team is just going to go, I literally don't know what I'm looking at. It's a huge problem. And then there's the Excel community. So everybody here, people with a voice, you've got MVPs like Danielle. You've got people that have got huge profiles across LinkedIn, YouTube, even Instagram and TikTok nowadays. Is it their responsibility to try and shift this? I don't think it is. But I do think that's the group that can have the biggest impact. And that's kind of one of my biggest messages, that I think this group of people should start talking about this as much as possible. It would be great if this was led from senior management at teams all over the place, but I just don't think there's awareness that this is a problem. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm coming close to the end. So the closing few slides. So what? So I've kind of preached a lot. I haven't shown you much technical stuff. You've seen a little bit of LET and LAMBDA, but so what? So I think for me, firstly, look, wherever you're at, if you're not comfortable with the fundamentals, don't go off course. Don't worry about LET and LAMBDA if you're still struggling with confidence on the basics. So just stick on the path that you're currently on. Get really comfortable with some ifs, some product, flags, factors, best practice modeling. Do that first before you get distracted. But secondly, try to be aware of this wider training roadmap. The roadmap from beginner to intermediate to expert has gone from there, and it's literally overnight-ish, over a year, gone like this. There's just more to learn. We've got to be aware of that, the size of that roadmap. And then this is probably the hardest one with all these new features. Understand when these features add value. So technically, yeah, LAMBDA, you can create anything you want almost. But why would you use it? Why would you need to put all of that logic in a named range and try and do it all in one cell? It's one of my biggest challenges with LET. It's amazingly clever that you can do all this stuff and name your variables in LET. I've spent 20 years learning to split my logic out into as many simple steps as possible. So why would I use LET? What situations does that make sense? And I forgot I left that in there, but I will just have a moan about this. So let's not create the next VBA expert situation. I can't stand people that use VBA for everything. I swear to God, about 10 years ago, there was just a wave of people that learned VBA and suddenly decided, well, everything should be solved with VBA. And I'm going to create a crazy dashboard with 10 buttons on the front sheet, and everybody just has to open up the spreadsheet and press these buttons in an order and it'll just work. And nobody else understands what the hell it does. I worked at a company on a contract once where I was sat next to a friend of mine in the management accounting team, and I watched him open up a spreadsheet for month end. The first thing he did was he got out a bit of paper, he went to this front sheet and he clicked a bunch of macro buttons in an order, and he kept looking back at this sheet and going, right, I've got to do that. I said, what are you doing? He's like, oh, I've got to do this. I was like, yeah, but why? What does it do? He's like, I don't know, but when I got given the model, I was told that I have to do this in this order or it doesn't work. I said, okay, let me play around with the model. It did nothing. So it copied and pasted a bunch of stuff to a worksheet that wasn't used. And every month, this guy had opened up this spreadsheet and tapped these buttons in an order, and it did nothing. Crazy. I hate VBA experts. I'm sorry if there are VBA experts here. Rant over. 4, teams, organizations need strategy. So I've been talking about this on another masterclass that I just recorded. I think for data in general, the way that we manage data, in terms of the tech stack that we use, teams and organizations need a strategy. One of the most common things we see with full stack is you go into a company, you teach teams how to use Power Query for the first time, and they love it. It's game changing because all you see is all of the hours that you're going to get back every month in the future. And you tell all your friends in the finance team and everybody starts using Power Query, and suddenly you've got hundreds of files popping up all over your shared drive, and there's repeated data everywhere and loads of unnecessary overlapping complexity. So at some point, if you're going to get really serious about this stuff, you need to go top down. And that means you need top down support because you need to figure out what tools you're going to use, what data you have, and what insights you want to get from that data. I think the final one, one more. So we need to guide, and I'm pretty sure that says inspire, the superstars of the future. So I just think if you go back to that distribution curve that I showed, most of the superstars of the future of our industry right now are probably in that phase where they're very uncomfortable with the idea of LET and LAMBDA and dynamic arrays. And I think we've got to do everything in our power to not put them off this career, because it's such a fantastic career. It's such a great community. I think that's where we can really help. And finally, to do all of this, you should all come and join the Full Stack Modeler. Some of you might cynically say that I'm saying all of this because I run a training company and I want you all to come and join it. You're absolutely right. But I'm not scaremongering. I also just believe what I'm saying. I also believe we do a really good job of doing the training. So if you come and join us, I will be completely happy. If you take anything away from this and you go and join someone else to do the training, I'll be less happy, but I'll still be happy for you. I think on that note, there you go. There's my details. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can have a look at Full Stack Modeler. If you want to see our range of membership options, we've got a really simple standard membership for about $48 a month, all the way through to a crazily good bundle, which is a partnership between us, the Financial Modeling Institute, Maven Analytics, and the Financial Modeling World Cup. 4 memberships bundled into one. It's just incredible.
I will send out the details with the email that we've got out.
Okay, and that is it. So there you go. Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope that was interesting. I'm sorry it wasn't tech heavy, but there you go.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys got lots of questions. I've got quite a few on online.
Excellent.
So anybody else want to jump in before I start reading out the questions in the chat? Any questions from the room?
I can ask a question.
Yes.
I was using the dynamic arrays plenty of times, and the thing I have noticed is like with error handling, like when it's returning Spiegel and all this kind of errors, like that can be tricky. So, when you have some data, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's one of the things.
Can you just rephrase that just in case I'm not thinking?
Yeah, so you're just kind of making the point that you have new error types, essentially. When you're using dynamic arrays, you've got things like a spill error, and it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, and the second thing, the Excel tables, they do not support dynamic array.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a completely new way of working. So I love, if you go back to my geek hat on and my trainer and my consultant, as a geek, I think they're amazing, but you do have to learn a new thing. Like you may never have seen a spill error before.
Yeah,
the whole concept that you type something in one cell and it spills to an array is pretty alien to people. But yes, you're also right that they don't work really.
Is there any special way to handle these errors, or just
not that I know of? No, I haven't seen anything special. So again, you when you're setting up anything that's kind of using a dynamic array, you might just have to be careful where you place other data and think ahead to, all right, if this is going to extend as an array this way, I should probably not put anything underneath, but it's quite hard to do sometimes.
Just curious about the sort of VBA balance to Lambda and LED. The way I look at it is VBA has always been able to do all of this, but with slightly different packaging, which some people might say is not as neat as compact, which could also be said as it's just really, really hard to understand compact code like that and debug it in a sequential way. Whereas in VBA, I mean, similar to this, it scares a lot of people. They go, I don't want to touch it, I don't trust it. I think Lambda LED is worse in every possible way when it comes to that acceptance of it, because you don't see the steps and it's just more black magic sort of thing. And very few people have actually gone into even like entry-level VBA. So I can see how this is like just really, really scary. But what problems can we now solve more of with this functionality compared to VBA? I see the structural outputs, right? But you can achieve that with VBA as well, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure there are that many new things you can solve. I'm not a VBA expert, so it's never been my territory. And I think I can't remember who I was talking to, was just saying that a lot of what you do now with even Power Query, you could have done with VBA before. In fact, the story that I was telling somebody was my business partner, Miles, when I showed him all this stuff with Power Query and with LAMBDA, and with and Power Automate with flows, we could set a flow up so you can automatically get data from a file. He was doing that 10 years ago with VBA. Yeah, I totally hear you. I probably don't have a great answer for that, to be honest.
Yeah, but that's cool. I get that.
I kind of have the same issue with it. I see, dynamic arrays absolutely aligned with financial modeling best practice for sure. LED, I see the use for it, being able to wrap things inside formulas. VBA, totally agree. I try to avoid it, but sometimes it does seem to not do it. And I kind of put lambdas with the same category. For me, it's about building a model that is easy for others to follow. And lambdas, I don't know, until maybe they become mainstream and then everybody's using them, and then they're so hard it's a black box that I struggle with.
And when the mainstream, it's just another function, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
That's what you want to get to, yeah.
5G that I referenced at the moment, the way that you do this sort of 5G approach is you've got pre-built Lambda code that goes on GitHub Gist. You use the advanced formula editor, which is an add-in for Excel, but it's still a little bit manual. You know, you're copying a URL and plugging it into the advanced formula editor. It's a bit clunky. I guess if Microsoft came up with a better solution to that, where you could really neatly store these certified lambdas in a place where it was accessible, you know, across your organization, that would be good.
But they can actually, so the user can actually follow what it's doing. I think that would be make it a bit more
I think there'll be the same issue and the same challenge with Let and Lambda, which is, you know, my slight off-tangent whinge about VBA was the overuse of it. And you could see the same thing happening with Let and Lambda. The really clever people, I think Dim early has said this a few times himself, when he first learned how to use all these clever lambdas, he suddenly found himself turning to them for everything, and then kind of checked himself and went, hang on a minute, this is not what I need to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I was telling you earlier, Charles, I hosted one of the Financial Modelling World Cup, or no, the Microsoft Excel World Championship semi-final the other night, and the lambdas were flying. These guys which use, and guys, obviously they're all guys, they just, the lambdas were just for everything. They're obviously really, really useful, but as a commentator, having to explain what that formula is doing and how it's solving the problem is quite difficult to explain to people.
And that's such an unnatural environment anyway, isn't it? To be under 30 minutes, well, maybe not in some meetings or some companies, but to have 30 minutes of pressure to have to build this nested lambda logic at that speed, it is unusual. And again, it's completely counter to all of the best practice training of take your time, split it out, make it as easy to read for everyone as you possibly can.
Sorry, Yuri.
No.
So we had a couple of questions online. Paul John asked if comments can be easily incorporated into formulas to help someone understand what each element is trying to do. So can you put comments inside a lambda?
Yeah, you can. So it's one of the things that Craig is very particular on.
Is this just with 5G or so not with ordinary lambdas? You can do that through the name manager. You would.
I'm not sure you can do it through the name manager. I might have to come back to you on that, but I know you definitely can on the 5G coding, and you can add lots of descriptive information there. And actually, a lot of what Craig's worked on is the guidance and the error management. So if you type something wrong, you can set it up so that you get all of this information back.
I'm going to ask, do you build all your Lambda functions into a template file and then start your models from this template? Or is there a way to import the Lambda functions which develop into Excel through the name manager? Yes, and I think you've answered that with the 5G.
Yeah, so at the moment, and as I say, I think it's quite clunky, and I wouldn't be surprised if there will be better ways of doing this in the future. You can go and have a look at Craig Hatmaker's GitHub Gist site. He's working all the time on this this particular area for financial modeling lambdas, and you download the free Excel Labs add-in. One of the features in there is the advanced formula environment, and you can just copy the URL from GitHub Gist. And you have to do it every time you open a new workbook, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. And then you've got all of those lambdas to call upon.
I'll add a link in the email that I'll send out to 5G.
Yeah.
Lucy says, amazing functions. Peter Bartle on new pizza.
He's there.
He says, I agree with the side that suggested let Lambda could proceed at pivot table. Some question about the FAST standard, which I've added some links there. Brent says, do you have some examples where these new functions have been used in debt modelling that is shared with banks and model auditors? If the models are right, need to be able to be shared with a wide range of financiers. I can't see it being used until everyone's comfortable with using these types of functions it's smart, but not really a useful solution until it's really tried.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. There's a whole issue around auditing and, just the practices that everybody has got used to in investment banking or whatever. So it's a huge issue. But again, something that I think, and Craig might kill me for saying this, I think he believes he's solved the issue with circularity and debt with LAMBDA. If he hasn't, I've probably just put him under an immense amount of pressure from an entire industry. But he has.
We actually ran he hosted a session recently where he went through that.
Yeah, so something like that. But if you've got a use case for LAMBDA where you are genuinely solving something that is unavoidably complex, and it gives you a better solution, I'm completely on board with it. I think trying to sort of swap it in for everything else doesn't make sense for the sake of it. Dynamic arrays, I think, is a bit different. I can completely see the use case, and I wouldn't be surprised in a few years' time if most professional models are built using entirely based on dynamic arrays. Wouldn't be surprised.
That's what I'm doing at the Global Excel Summit, financial modelling with dynamic arrays.
Yeah.
So,
That makes
it's
perfect
quite a challenge though to make all of the formulas.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like you have to, or we should be aiming to get, you're either all in or you're not. You should be doing models where it's all dynamic arrays or you're not using them. But, we'll get there.
And there's a bit of a back and forwards between Peter Bartholomew and Brent, so I won't go into all of that.
Do my reading entertainment tomorrow morning.
Annotate says you're doing an amazing job at full stack modeler.
Thanks, Anna.
Without any bias. The best training I've had so far in my professional career.
There you go.
Yeah,
Thanks, Anna.
everyone's saying wonderful presentation and Peter Bartholomew says let LAMBDA have a platform independent and don't have two distinct environments. And kind of says, can we leverage ChatGPT to add comments to explain LAMBDA and let functions to document the logic and flow of formulas?
So I think, at the moment, I don't think you can, and I correct me if anybody knows if I'm wrong, but I don't think ChatGPT is quite as up to date with the most recent changes to Excel as we are. That was certainly what it was a month or so ago. You can do it in Power Query, by the way. So I've been doing this a lot. So some of the best practice around Power Query that we teach is, you should rename your steps. You should add some descriptive text. You can do that in the properties in Power Query. If you're quite lazy, and I'm not saying this is how you should approach it, if you had a lot of existing Power Query code, you can go to ChatGPT and copy the code, paste it into ChatGPT and go, make this better. And it will change the code and you can copy it back into the advanced formula environment and it'll look great. Editor, advanced formula editor, there you go.
Any other questions or comments from anyone before we finish off?
So is VBA obsolete now, or and I'm not a VBA expert, but I was a VBA user?
No, it's
or is it
it's
just
not.
a different tool?
It's we kind of, so there's a few things we don't train in full stack. VBA is one of them. We've got people in the community that are brilliant at VBA. So if anybody wanted to come in and learn a bit about it, that's fine. We don't train VLOOKUP because I hate it and I don't think anybody should use it. And I'm still waiting for somebody to give me the right use case for why they need to use VLOOKUP and not index and match or XLOOKUP. But it's definitely not obsolete. If Miles was here next to me, my business partner, he'd be telling you some of the great ways that he uses VBA. So it's a little bit biased because you've got me talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, people always ask, what should I learn? And I say, if you have the time, I would say probably hands down Power Query.
Yeah.
I wouldn't, VBA is useful, but I don't think you would get as much benefit from the time investment that it would take to learn it that you will by something like, Power Query, Power BI, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Can you recommend any books on Power Query?
Oh, I thought you were going to say Excel, and I was going to say there's a great book called Financial Modeling for Dummies. Let me properly come back to you on that. Yeah, there's probably a few. I just personally, and this isn't me trying to promote full stack. I just find it hard to get into the real detail of these kind of topics from a book. Just find it so much easier to do stuff.
And because it changes, I've had to produce multiple editions of these books because they just change, and then it's not the latest way of doing it, and how various.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking because there is a couple of books which I read. One is M for Data Monkey, and the other one is it's very sexy name like that transform load and yeah. And they are pretty well detailed, but there are some things like about describing M language, because it's a lot of technical documentation on Microsoft side, but it's a bit dry. So some concepts I really had to grasp, like lists and that kind of things. So just wanting to know.
Let me come back with a proper answer, and I might even just reach out to a few people in the full stack community and just ask what they've read. But yeah, my personal you're right. One of the big benefits of Power Query that I really like is that you could get away with never writing a line of M code in your life, and you could still use Power Query to do 90% of what you need to. But if you want the coding side, yeah, I'll try and help you out with that. Awesome.
Well, with that, I think we will finish up. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating, wonderful, and on behalf of the Sydney Financial Modelers, we'd like to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Thanks, everybody.